Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for coming out tonight. My name is Koji, and I'm a postdoc fellow at UCLA. And what I'm going to talk to you today about is a lot of the research I've been doing over the last 10 years on the Gila River incarceration camp of Japanese Americans during World War II, and the place where my family, my grandparents, aunts and uncles were incarcerated during the war. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of Japanese American incarceration, just to give you some context for those less familiar with the subject, and then a little bit about how I approach research, both in archaeology and in history, and then moving on to the history of the Gila River incarceration camp itself, and then the research that I've done in collaboration with the Gila River Indian Community Cultural Resource Management Program, who I've worked with since 2014. I see some people out in the audience. And have been really fortunate enough to collaborate with on this research. So Japanese American incarceration. In World War II, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 1941, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. And this created an exclusion zone along the west coast of the United States. And in that exclusion zone, which encompassed all of California, the western halves of Washington and Oregon, and the southern, about a third of Arizona, anybody of Japanese ancestry, they say up to about 1/16 Japanese ancestry, was forcibly removed and sent to incarceration camps. At that time, there were about 110,000 people of Japanese ancestry who lived within the exclusion zone, most of the Japanese Americans in the United States. And these regions had a long history of anti-Japanese sentiment, and I think it's also important to remember that about 2/3 of the people of Japanese ancestry in this area were American citizens. They were born in the United States, they had US citizenship, and the remaining third, known as Issei, who migrated from Japan to the United States, were legally barred from citizenship at the time. Up until 1952, if you immigrated from Asia, you weren't allowed to naturalize as a US citizen, with a few exceptions. So this exclusion zone was created. 110,000 people were moved into the incarceration camps, and about a little less than 10,000 were born inside camp. And then a civilian agency, the War Relocation Authority, was set up to administer the camps. They operated from 1942 to 1946. So generally, when we talk about Japanese American incarceration, we think of the 10 incarceration camps that were set up. There were 2 in California, Tule Lake and Manzanar, 2 in Arizona, Poston, which was on the Colorado River Indian Community Reservation, and Gila River, which was on Gila River here, the Gila River Indian Community Reservation. And then Topaz in Utah, Minidoka in Idaho, Heart Mountain in Wyoming, Amachi or Granada in Colorado, and Jerome and Rower in Arkansas. Each camp held between about 8,000 to 17,000 people. Now, the map of incarceration starts to grow when we incorporate other sites, including assembly centers or temporary detention facilities that Japanese Americans were sent to before going into the main camps as the main camps were being constructed. Here's an example of the Tanforan racetrack in California, just south of San Francisco. This was a racetrack that was converted into a temporary detention facility for Japanese Americans. So people were sent to these facilities as the main camps were being built. They were often racetracks, fairgrounds. They converted horse stalls. Here are horse stalls that were converted into barracks. And today, Tanforan is a shopping mall. This is a little memorial on the right-hand side that was built to commemorate its usage as an assembly center. And then there are all these other sites in blue and green you can see across the map, which were other sites of detention. So while we think often of Japanese American incarceration that was taking place in these main 10 camps, it really took place in a swath of different locations all across the United States, mostly along the western coast, but you can see along the south and the eastern seaboard, and several sites of confinement in Hawaii as well as a few sites in Alaska. And then sort of the most prevalent area that often doesn't get commemorated are wartime civilian control stations. These were spots that people were processed in. So there's that exclusion zone, all that colored portion of the map on the right, and it was divided into 108 sections. Each section contained about 1,000 Japanese Americans living in them, and each of those sections had a civilian control station set up where people were processed. This is the site where people were literally tagged before going into the incarceration camp. They were registered, inoculated, tagged, and then assigned numbers, which they would tag their suitcases. They're the Machida family on the right-hand side in Hayward, in the East Bay in California. You can see they have their suitcases, and people were only allowed to bring what they could carry as they were going into the camp. So they were processed through these civil control stations, sent to those temporary detention facilities, and then from there went into the incarceration camps. And this is one civil control station in San Francisco, in Japantown. And you can see the building on the right-hand side looks pretty much exactly the same. It has commemorative plaques. It's one of the few that do, but most of these have no form of commemoration. You walk by them, the buildings still exist today throughout California, Arizona, and Colorado, and most people have no idea their sort of role in this process. So I'm an archaeologist. I studied archaeology in my undergraduate in Scotland. I went to the University of Edinburgh. I grew up in the Bay Area, but I went to Scotland for my undergraduate, and then came back, worked in the Bay Area in archaeology for a little bit, and studied at San Francisco State University, and then to Stanford University for my graduate degree. And the kind of archaeology that I've been really trying to do is what's known as community-based archaeology. And so this has a long history. A lot of archaeologists have really forefronted community-based archaeology, which is an archaeology that has an attention to the local, to the communities around, that are both tied to, have historic and personal ties to sites of archaeology, and live around sites. An archaeology which centers those needs rather than the needs of academia or the needs of research for research's sake. Intentional long-term outreach, community building, highlighting the voices of members, and realizing that knowledge is co-created, it doesn't come from me. And it weaves those different perspectives together in trying to understand the past. And in my work at Gila River, there's also been a growing movement in archaeology to think about what role archaeology's played within, especially North America, as a role of colonial science, and what it means to recognize the harms archaeology's done in the past and how not to repeat those harms. How does archaeology work to serve the communities and not infringe upon rights in reservations, not infringe upon indigenous rights, not replicate the past violences and extractive practices of just coming in, taking out knowledge, and not giving anything back. Waiting for the projector to go back on. But those are sort of the precepts and concepts that my training, I've been fortunate to have some really great mentors and collaborators throughout my education and work in archaeology, has set up to approach how do we study the past. And this has been a movement that's been growing over the last 20, 30 years. I'm certainly not the first person to talk about this. And I've benefited for a lot of the real trailblazers, people who have pioneered this method, especially from indigenous communities who have worked in archaeology. So the research methods that I've used, which will come up, there you go, were formed in collaboration with the Gila River Indian Community Cultural Resource Management Program and the Tribal Historic Preservation Office, focusing on pedestrian survey, UAV or drone mapping, total station mapping, we call catch and release, portable X-ray fluorescence, ethnography with Japanese American communities, oral history, and archival. I'll talk a little bit about more what each of some of these methods mean. So pedestrian survey, and I'll state, that these methods were designed primarily to have low impact on the sites. So the sites that we've been working at Gila River in talking to members of the Cultural Resource Management Program here and Tribal Historic Preservation Office and Barnaby Lewis, there was a concern that the archaeology not impact the site much, that nothing's taken out, that we don't dig, that we don't remove things and take them away, but rather think about methodologies that can give a bunch of knowledge and data about the site so we can learn about it, but also have really low impact as possible on the site itself. So we started with pedestrian surveys, which is walking along the site and then cataloging, photographing, and taking sort of GPS points at different kinds of features, trying to figure out what's out there, what's left, where it's at. So these are some maps of the 2 camps at Gila River, and I'll talk a little bit about more of these camps. And these lines are the lines myself and my collaborators walked across. We walked back and forth each of these lines, 48 transects at Butte Camp and about 100 at Canal Camp. And at every time we saw an archaeological feature, a structural remain, we focused on gardens. We took a GPS point, we photographed it to get an idea of where things were. This is just sort of what it looked like in the process on site. And there on the right hand, you can see an example of some of the archaeological features. This was a pond that was built at the Gila River Incarceration Camp. These are some of the results of that survey. We had gone out expecting to find maybe a couple of dozen garden-related features. A lot of the research that I've done is focused on gardens. And we were starting to find over 400 features throughout the camp. Really lots of remains of garden practices that Japanese Americans undertook while incarcerated here. Used a lot of unmanned aerial vehicle or UAV drone surveys, basically taking a drone and flying it up to take photographs of the landscape. And this was helpful. This is an example of what a Google Earth image looks like of one of the residential blocks at Gila. And then the sort of resolution you can get through drone photography. So really a lot more in-depth and precise. It gives a real picture of what the landscape looks like. And then using what's called orthomosaics, you can create what's a digital elevation map. What this is basically a 3D map of the surface. So this is that same area, but you could see little sort of square divots in the map. And these are areas that are depressions and help identify features. So we were trying to identify where basements were built underneath the barracks. And you could see in the map, it's really hard to see the contours and the elevations of the landscape. But using photogrammetry, stitching together these photos, you could start to see some of the areas where there were depressions that were likely basements built by incarcerees in the camp. We also did total station surveys. A total station is a high precision mapping device. Many of you who don't work in archaeology have probably seen these at construction sites. Essentially, it's a computer with a prism that shoots a laser at a prism and then calculates a precise distance. And you take a lot of points and you can start to map out different features. And so these are all different features that we found in that site. I'll return to this so you can see sort of what that looks like in practice and what we found. Then we did what we call catch and release surveys. And basically, it's taking artifacts that are on site, cataloging them, and then putting them back. So catching them, photographing them, describing them, and then returning to where we took them out. So we're not taking it away to the lab, we're looking at it on site. These are some of my collaborators who worked with me in the winter of 2020. We did this between November of 2019 and February of 2020, right before everything started to shut down. And so we went and we found these large refuse deposits. We cataloged the materials, getting an understanding of what was there, and then we returned it all back to exactly where we took it off of. And so this is how we were able to gather a lot of information about the site while not extracting anything, leaving it there. And then finally, the image will come up eventually, but we did what's called PXRS, or portable X-ray fluorescence, which is a non-destructive way to understand the material composition of items. So essentially, you have a small X-ray gun that shoots some beams at an object, records the bounce back from those beams. The bounce back at different levels of different chemicals can give you a signature of what that was made of. And that was helpful for looking at vesicular basalt, which was incorporated into some of the features at Gila, and is not present in the local geology around where the camp is, but came from other parts of the nearby landscape. So in this image that's coming up, where is it? There it is. You can see in red circles, these are all vesicular basalt cobbles that are on the side of a pond at Gila River. And these aren't from local areas. So most of the rocks that are incorporated into these features are granite and schist, things that are found nearby in the buttes around. But these we were able to actually trace from the Santan Mountains. And so that meant that people would have had to either go off and get them on a trip, or trade to get them from somebody else. So they're not from the area. These are only in a few features. So we used PXRF to identify where they come from without having to break or destroy these, which were sort of the older techniques that you used to have to do to get that kind of chemical composition. And then finally, archival research and oral histories. These are photographs from my family's photo album from their time at Gila River. They were here from August of 1942 until 1944. That's my aunt on the front steps of the barrack they lived in, and my grandmother, my uncle as a baby who was born here, in the hospital at Gila, and my aunt sitting in the steps next to him. So I was very fortunate to be able to do an oral history with my grandmother and some of my aunties who are still alive, who were in camp before they passed away, and use some of our own family's archival materials, talk to other families, and look at their photographs, their letters, their journals. It's been incredible, the amount of things that people have been able to share and willing to share with me, and talking about their family's experience who were also incarcerated at Gila River during the war. So the camp itself, Gila, this is a photograph from my family's photo album taken from atop a butte at one of the camps, and that's their block in the foreground. Gila, the incarceration camp, was opened in July of 1942 and operated for 3.5 years, closing in 1945. It was called the Rivers Relocation Center. Rivers, it was named after Jim Rivers, who was the first of the men to die fighting in World War I as a US soldier. And it held between about 13,300 people, that was its peak population, but 16,000 Japanese Americans passed through it. And that's not including the non-Japanese administrative and military personnel who worked there. It was considered the 4th largest city in Arizona during the time of its operation, after Tucson, Phoenix, and the post-incarceration camp, which had about 17,000 people in it. Most of the Japanese Americans who were incarcerated at Gila River came from the LA area, the Southern California coast, Central Valley around Fresno, and then the Sacramento Delta area and the San Francisco Bay Area. So you can see those areas that they were taken from and incarcerated at Gila. It was divided into 2 sub-camps. Butte Camp, which was the largest of the 2, had about 8,500 people. And you can see it had residential blocks, schools, community service areas, warehouses, a camouflage net factory, administrative buildings, and a hospital. And then Canal Camp, which held about 4,500 people. It was about 3 miles east of Butte Camp. And it similarly had residential areas, schools, community service building, staff housing, recreation areas and warehouses, as well as a military post. And then these are just some photos of labor practices at Gila. So in addition to the confinement site, the camp had a huge amount of agricultural activity associated with it. The Japanese Americans were meant to farm in order to make the camp, in order to produce their own food. The idea was the camps were supposed to be run basically as cheaply as possible. So when people were put to labor, they farmed. It was actually the most productive of the 10 incarceration camps. They shipped vegetables to the other camps. They had a dairy farm. There was a model ship factory where people made ships that were used for air pilots to train on for bombing missions. They also had a camouflage net factory, a vegetable dehydration plant, 2 experimental sewage farms, a co-op, fishmongers. This is a toy loan that my grandmother was involved in starting, which was basically like a library where kids could check out toys. And people engaged in a variety of other activities, including sports, hanamatsuri or festivals, obon dances, social dances, and that was some images of mochi making. Mochi is a Japanese pounded rice cake that's traditionally made at New Year's. And so people were able to practice a lot of traditional activities still, despite the context of being incarcerated because of their identity. And then I'll wait until the next, the projector's back on. There's a rare color photograph of Gila River during its operation, which is kind of nice to see because we always see these black and white photos that make the past feel very distant. But I always think seeing something in sort of a color photograph helps to make it feel a little bit more contemporaneous. So while that's loading, Gila, when the photo comes back up, you'll see was most of the incarceration camps had sort of bare black tar paper walls and roofs. At Gila River, the roofs were red, had sort of a double-eaved roof in red, that you can see, and white walls. And it was considered a quote-unquote show camp. It was supposed to be the nicest of the 10 camps, such that Eleanor Roosevelt came and visited as a big publicity trip to show, we're trying to treat people well. The U.S. government is not putting people in prison. Look how pleasant this camp looks. It's sort of a propaganda during the wartime. But you can see those red house roofs and then the white walls of the incarceration camp. It's also important to remember that Gila, as I'm sure many of you know, is a place that holds valley fever, which most Japanese Americans who went to the camp were not exposed to. So coccidioides is a soil-bound fungus that when breathed in can cause coccidiomycosis, known as valley fever, which can manifest in fatigue, fever, cough, shortness of breath, headaches, joint pain, rashes. In some cases, meningitis and death. There were at least 3 recorded deaths of Japanese Americans from valley fever from their time in camp. And you can see from the CDC map that the area where Gila River is one of the most endemic places in the United States, along with some of the California Central Valley for the valley fever fungus. So it was a constant problem, medical problem at the camp, because most of the Japanese Americans weren't exposed to this before coming to camp, and then the dust from the air really exacerbated that. Thinking about what we focused on in our archaeology at Gila, thinking about the gardens was a big portion. They're one of the more prevalent features. And this is again that photograph of my aunt on the stairs of her barrack. And you can see these tall castor beams that were planted outside. So the gardens are both aesthetic, they were spiritual, they had lots of different meanings, and then they were environmental. So they provided environmental transformation to the camp. These, when I was talking to some of my aunties about, what did our family plant, why were they here? They talked about the castor beans being these quick growing plants that also provided shade and were windbreaks so that the barracks weren't as exposed to the wind. There are other oral history testimonies for families where people said that the dust storms that were exposed and actually the construction of the camp intensified because of the clearing of all of the plants when they constructed it. the dust storms grew less intense after people planted gardens. They planted ponds, they reduced the exposed topsoil, and then these trees and other kinds of plants like castorines help reduce the intensity, which really help with things like breathing in the dust and those health concerns with valley fever. Here's a pond. You can see a small island in the center and some rock adornments around it. And some areas where there was joint construction across sites. So this is where the barracks would have been. There's those little footings you can sort of see in the background. And garden plots, a pond, and some pathways. And this is not only interesting in just sort of the complexity of the garden, but really shows coordination across different barracks where people are working together. So some places, people are working to create these joint garden ventures across the barracks. Each barrack was divided into 4 apartments. So you have 4 different families living in the same building. But here is a case where the families collaborated. There's ceramic pipe, granite, and concrete all incorporated into the garden. Other gardens and ponds show segmentations. There are some places where people work together, other places where people divided the area into little lots and sort of created their own individual yards. There are also areas where people work to express their identity. When the projector comes back up, there's a pond with Japanese inscribed along the edge, and it says, Showa Junana Hachikatsu, or the 17th year of the Showa era in August. And so this was a traditional Japanese calendar. It's notable, I think, because the Showa era, the traditional way of marking the calendar in Japan, is the era of the ascension of the emperor to the throne. And so it shows a direct allusion to Japan, to the emperor, all things that were criminalized at this time. These were the reasons that people were being put into camp. They were suspected of being too loyal, quote unquote, to the emperor of Japan. And yet there are these subtle markings on the side of garden features where people felt that they could express their identity in subtle forms of resistance against the reasons that they were put into the incarceration camp. There you can see it at the top right, the Japanese lettering along the side of the pond. Most of these ponds are asymmetrical. They have stones incorporated to them and plants, which are all aspects of traditional Japanese garden design. So here again are those dots that I showed you from the total station map earlier. And they allow, with overlaying historical maps, a sense of what the different aspects of the block look like. And I'm just going to take away the background image so you can see that better. You can see in blue where garden ponds are. Those dotted lines are basements or depressions that people dug out beneath the barracks. And you can see a lot of times there are a few that go through multiple apartments, but most of them map onto individual apartments. There's some fence lines, and then those little sort of black, dark sections at the end of the barracks, those are gravel pads where people would put gravel out in front of the doorways as sort of a landing. So you're walking on not just sort of the soil, but you have a little entranceway. Here's another block from Canal Camp, and you can see again a lot of these entryways outside the barracks and the ponds, and fewer basements. So when I've been talking to families, they always ask, because I sort of show them some of the results in archaeology, why are people building basements, what are they doing? A lot of people built basements because it was cooler. You know, it's hot in the daytime, you dig out underneath the barrack and the temperature's lower, you could hang out, you could play cards. But people also got up to all sorts of sort of shenanigans. There was an internal security report from July of 1945 from apartment 53D, which is that apartment where we found a basement. And it said that the raid produced 1.5 gallons of Raisin Jack, 1 quart of sake, and a barrel with 35 gallons of sake mash fermenting. Tom Yoshihara was charged with the crime of manufacturing liquor and admitted that this was his second batch of sake that he brewed there. and that he kept the barrels in his basement, but he used the basement mostly for sleeping, so he didn't think he really deserved to be charged with anything. Other basements were the sites of dice games, cards, gambling was a really big thing that happened to them. So people used these basements for a variety of ways. One of the things I think that they most highlighted was people's search for privacy. The barrack apartments, the walls were thin, they didn't go all the way up to the eaves of the roof, so you could hear everything going on inside the barrack. You're under constant surveillance when you're outside. These basements were ways that people can sort of pursue some modes of privacy away from each other, away from the camp administrators, and then often do things like drink and gamble, but have a sense of sort of your own place and self. There are also other landscaping features like sumo wrestling courts. You can see in some of these images, it's hard to make out, but here's one. You can see sort of a square there and a faint outline of a circle in the middle. If we go to those digital elevation model, you can see that square relief against the side. Sumo wrestling was a popular sport. It's the national sport of Japan. It was very popular amongst Japanese Americans, especially farmers. It has lots of ties to Shinto and religion and ties to the earth. And here are some photographs of sumo at Gila River in the incarceration camp. It was really popular. There were at least 4 sumo wrestling platforms at Gila. There were tournaments. There were people who did sumo wrestling nightly. There are all sorts of accounts of people going out every night doing sumo wrestling. And then this is the Thanksgiving celebration. Sumo is a really popular activity at these celebrations and festivals. And so it's also one of the more enduring archaeological traces of what people were doing at the camp. And then going a little bit to material culture. So with those catch and release surveys, we looked at what kinds of things were in the trash deposits. There are these large trash dumps associated with Gila River. What are people throwing away? What can we learn about what people were doing in camp? And to get a sense of how camp impacted people's habits, I looked at some trash from a historic Japantown in Santa Barbara, where the people went eventually to Gila. So on the left-hand side, you'll see pictures of items from Santa Barbara, on the right hand from Gila River. And the people from Santa Barbara, almost all went to Gila during the war. That's where they were incarcerated. In terms of medicine, there's a lot of Japanese-produced medicines in Santa Barbara, local pharmacies, which is, I think, fairly typical of the early 20th century. People getting patent medicines, people importing medicine from Japan. At Gila River, there's almost no Japanese medicine bottles. There's only a few. There are a couple in the display cabinet up if you have time, if you haven't seen them before. But very few, and that's because people couldn't order things from Japan, obviously. During the wartime, there are a few pharmacies that were located in Colorado that people could mail order medicines, but most traditional medicines that people were ordering from Japan were not present. People had to go to the hospitals for their health care, which was not what a lot of people generally did for everyday ailments in the early 20th century, especially in these smaller farming communities. Most Japanese Americans had sort of personalized regimes of care. And at Gila, they were forced to go into these big institutional hospitals, which was problematic because people didn't trust them. People didn't trust the doctors. They didn't trust the War Relocation Authority. And so a lot of people avoided those environments. And so we see hospital pill bottles, sanitary cleaning things from the hospitals, but we don't see as many of these sort of personalized regimes of care from before the war. We also see in the pre-war assemblage a lot of Japanese manufactured ceramics, French and American manufactured porcelains and earthenware plates. And at Gila, there are a few Japanese manufactured ceramics. They're probably one of the larger portions of non-quote-unquote institutional ceramics. But the majority of things are those all the way on the right hand, which were US produced military quartermaster ceramics. It's what we often call hotelware. And it's a thick white ironstone. You'll probably see it at like diners still today. And it's a really mass-produced, cheap, durable kind of ceramic was supplied to the Army. And there's tons of it that was used in the mess halls. And so that's the kind of dishes that people were using at an incarceration camp. But they did bring in some smaller sets of bowls and cups. And we do see traces of those practices from home that are being brought up to the incarceration camp. There's also different sodas. There was soda available. Before the war, we see a lot of local products, local soda water bottles, dairy bottles from different places. And at Gila, there's a lot of national brands soda bottles, Coca-Cola and Pepsi. There's a lot of things from those. It's interesting that in pre-war context, I've looked at archaeology reports from Japan towns throughout California. There's rarely any Coca-Cola bottles from before 1942. And I think this is pretty emblematic of Coke not being available in smaller communities, at least not widely available. People would go to like the soda shop, they'd have fountain drinks. It's available in like the San Franciscos and LAs and Oaklands. When you get into these smaller communities, people don't necessarily have access or the funds to buy soda. But at Gila, in the incarceration camp, it's one of the only produced beverages. You're not going to your local soda shop. You just can order things through catalogs. You can get things from the co-op store, and you have this sort of introduction of these national brand beverages rather than the locally produced. So we see a few material changes, a real direction towards institutional material practices, hospitals, mess halls, much fewer Japanese medicines. All the Japanese items we found at Gila River are individuals, they aren't sets. Before the war, it's really common to have like sets of bowls or sets of cups that you would use both for dining with your family, but also for hosting people. They're only individual, and that's probably a reaction to only being able to bring what you can carry. You can't take a whole set of bowls, but you can maybe take one or two. Less local products and more national brands. And sort of redirecting of the market from people buying things from international manufacturers to only in the United States, which again is sort of not surprising given the context of war. And then finally, I just want to think about for a moment the impact of the incarceration camp, the material traces. These are some of those quartermaster hotelware dishes. While the history of the Gila River incarceration camp is often found in the archives or in anecdotes and oral histories, the material remains of it are extremely present. And this is what's enabled me to do my research, but it's also left an enduring mark upon the landscape. Gila River closed in 1945, and the War Relocation Authority was supposed to clear out all the buildings and materials of the camp. So going back for a moment, the War Relocation Authority decided to build the incarceration camp here on the Gila River Indian Community Reservation in concert with the War Department, the Department of the Interior, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and without contacting or asking for approval from the Gila River Indian Community itself. Eventually, they did ask after everybody decided they wanted to build, everybody in the federal government decided they wanted to build the camp on Gila River, and the tribal council said no. And then they started construction of the camp in 1942, and they asked again, and the vote was no. And then Japanese Americans started arriving in August of 42. And by October, the government of Gila River approved leasing of the land. And essentially, they approved it because the federal government told them, Japanese Americans are already moving in, we built the camp, and you could either lease it to us and get money, or not lease it to us and get nothing from it. So they decided to enter into a memorandum of agreement. They leased the land for both a rent cost as well as a promise for certain improvements to be made to the landscape, and for the WWII to clear out the camp when they left. Most of the improvements were not made. and the WRA did not clear out the camp when they left. And so the Gila River Indian Community sued the federal government in the 1970s. It took about 20 years for that lawsuit to get processed, and eventually they did receive restitution from it. But the physical traces of the camp were left. Literally scarring parts of the landscape where dugouts were made for trash deposits that not only left portions of the landscape unusable, the foundations, these huge trash deposits, but often also attract looters, people who trespass without permission onto community land just to take things, bottle hunters, and so have an enduring impact. And I like to think about that impact and these layers of history that aren't just portions of the past, things that happened in the 1940s, but have resonance and meaning today. A lot of sites of Japanese American incarceration have been reused today as sites of migrant detention. There are organizations like Sue for Solidarity, which protest child migrant detention facility sites that are built near to or next to sites of Japanese American incarceration. You sort of remember that larger map that showed all of those dots across the United States. Sue for Solidarity folds paper cranes to bring attention to and protest the use of sites of detention, which are often reused sites or next to sites that were used to incarcerate Japanese Americans during World War II. And as we sort of think about the 20th century and the 21st century, camps continue to be extremely prevalent as places to house the displaced, migrants fleeing economic deprivation, climate change, war. There are over 17 million people, and I'm sure that's a small count, who are displaced around the world. The average time spent in a refugee camp is about 16 years globally. And so as we think about the impact of camps, it's important to think about the ways in which they're being used and applied in the present, they've been used and applied in the past, and have real enduring impacts. A lot of the people that I've talked to, a lot of the families that I've spoken to about Gila River will tell me that many of their family members never talked about camp after the war. There were many silences, that many of their family members changed from their experience of incarceration, that there were large numbers of loss from the property that they lost when they left for camp, from their sicknesses that they endured while in camp. And I hope that by bringing attention to these histories, by talking about them, by thinking through them seriously, we can move to a place where camps are no longer used as a solution to the problems of displacement and migration. Now I want to end with an image when it comes up of my grandmother in front of a saguaro at Gila River. And it's a picture they took in 1944, my grandmother, my uncle, my aunt next to the tree. And I like to end with this photo because I was talking to a friend of mine, a scholar at UC Irvine, Fantasia Painter, who's a Autumn woman. She does research on the U.S.-Mexico border. We were talking about saguaro. And I was showing her this picture of my grandmother in front of this cactus. And she was telling me how, for her, as an Autumn person, saguaro is a person. They lived for 250 years. And she said if that cactus is still there, she probably remembers your grandmother there. And I like to think about that and the memories that the landscape hold, that these were sites not only of trauma and violence, but also sites that created new relationships and of memories that aren't always suffused with pain, but also with moments of joy, with moments of beauty, despite the context of the incarceration camp. So I always like to look at this photo, think about my grandmother who passed away a few years ago, and of the saguaro that hopefully still remembers her and other family members who were out here during the 1940s. So thank you so much. There's a whole host of people that have supported this research over the last 10 years. Too many to name, but it really is a group effort. And so while I focus on this research. I'm only one of many who contributed. So thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions. Yes?
I know you said that a lot of people didn't talk about it, but for the ones that did talk, was it just kind of a different experience for everybody, like some good, some bad, or was it overall horrible?
Yeah, so there's a real trend in the experience of people who are incarcerated at Gila River, depending on the age they're in camp. A lot of the people I've spoken to who were children, 12 and younger during the incarceration, have told me sometimes they feel a little embarrassed, and they'll say, you know, actually, I had fun in camp. It was like, there were no rules, we went out, I got to play with my friends all day, I could eat with them, we had all sorts of adventures. I didn't really realize what the loss was. In Japanese, there's a phrase, kodomo no tameni, which means for the sake of the children. And it is sort of a product of a lot of parents shielding the impact of the incarceration from the kids, working to make places of beauty like gardens, so that they wouldn't have to experience some of the harsh conditions of the incarceration camp. But many of those same people will say, but my parents never talked about it. Or one person I talked to who was 18, Yoshi Nakamura, he served in the 442, the US military unit of Japanese soldiers during World War II. And he said his dad was never the same after camp. He fell, injured his hip from the hard floors of one of the racetracks they were in Southern California, and couldn't work after camp. And he said he just became a sort of hard and bitter man after his experience. And that wasn't his memories of him before camp. So I really think it depended a lot on your age, how you went through camp. The Issei or older generation often lost more, or at least was more aware of the loss of jobs, of careers, of houses, of farms, and the dignity of being incarcerated in those positions. So there was a lot of varied experience. Some people had fun, some people had horrible experiences, and so there's just really this wide range of how people remember it and how they talk about it. And some people will share stories and ask me not to share them with other people, but they say, you know, I just wanted to say it once to somebody because I've never spoken about it. And so I think there's a real variance into these different ways that people went through camp. But it's important to remember both those hard experiences, but also the way I think people found joy despite the context of the incarceration. But thank you for that question.
I actually have another question. It's twofold. I'm wondering, did they get any, when they were released finally, did they get anything back or any compensation? And what happened to the land that they left? Did people take it, or what happened?
So in regards to whether people were compensated, when they left camp, people were given a bus ticket back to where they were coming from and $20. And that was sort of the thank you very much on your way down. In 1982, Congress created a commission in reaction to community activism on wartime relocation of civilian internees. I think that's what the commission was called. And they did a series of listening sessions where they invited people to testify. And eventually this culminated in the passage of the Civil Rights Act, or the Civil Liberties Act, at the end of the 1980s. And all people who were incarcerated in camp and were still alive by the time the act passed were given $20,000 from the US government and an official apology. So this was signed into law by Ronald Reagan. The checks went out between George Bush Sr. and Bill Clinton presidencies. Some people accepted the checks, some people didn't. Some people were insulted. Obviously $20,000, even accounting for the change between 1942 and 1992, did not account for the material losses. And the sort of great irony of that is that most of the people who were working and who lost a property have passed away by then. You know, a lot of the Issei, the older generation, were never alive to see those checks, to get that kind of financial restitution, as small as it was. So there were some financial reparations that were given in the early 90s, but it was very small compared to the material loss, of course. And for many people, you know, there was no amount of money that could ever really make up for those losses and indignity of forced incarceration. With regards to the land back in Arizona, California, Washington, Oregon, first generation migrants were not legally allowed to own land at that time. There was a series of legislations called alien land laws that were passed in states that said those who were ineligible for citizenship could not own property. And so this was sort of mostly targeted at Asian migrants during the late 19th and early 20th century. And it meant that people mostly had to lease farmland. People who were born in the United States could purchase land, but because of the sort of history of immigration from Japan, most American-born Japanese were at that time kids to teenagers. And so some people did buy houses in the names of their children and were able to hold on to them. Most people didn't. The people who were able to hold on to their houses also faced difficulties with paying taxes. There were only a few opportunities for work inside the camp. They paid $12 to $16 a month, which is much lower than the standard wage at that time, $12 a month. $12 is often what people would make in 1 to 2 days of work in that time. That's what you were paid for working full-time per month. And so if you couldn't pay your property taxes, or if you had a mortgage, you couldn't necessarily pay your mortgage. There were storage facilities set up by the federal government for people to put their things in before they were sent to camp, but many of those were broken into. They were poorly secure. They're often just like a church warehouse with a padlock that nobody checked on for 2 years. And there are all sorts of inspection reports that show when the government did go back to look at these storage sites, people had burnt them down, people had taken things and stolen all the items from them. So a lot of people lost a lot of property. There are some cases where neighbors did look after the property for people. There are many cases where community members did sort of reach out and help, but in most cases that was not the experience of families, and so there was a large amount of loss when going to camp. Any other questions?
So thank you for coming on, Bobby, and whatever you're doing in the community. So it's a concentration camp. So I wonder about information and then where they were at and Gila River people they were interacting with discussion of interaction between our people and them during that time.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So with regards to interactions across communities between the camp, people were aware that they're going, well, initially when people came to Gila River, there was a lot of confusion. People didn't know where they were going exactly. They didn't know how long they would be here. The camp was still being constructed when the first waves of Japanese Americans arrived. And one man, Ken Hayashi, told me that he came back in 1992 or 1994 with his dad on a visit. It was like an official reunion. And they came out onto Gila River, and his dad looked out at the landscape and saw ditches, and there were a lot of these drainage ditches. And in 1992, he says, Dad started to cry. He was like, Dad, what's going on? Right? And his dad said that he remembers coming to camp and seeing those ditches when they got here and thinking that they'd be shot when they arrived on site and just feeling so afraid. And of course that never happened, but that fear sort of swelled back up into him coming back 50 years later. And there was a lot of this sort of uncertainty about where they were and what was going to be done with them when they got to camp. There are stories of people eventually leaving the camp area. Gila River was one of the few camps where they took down the main fence around the camp. So it had a fence initially, it had a few guard towers. The administration took them down because they said it was bad for morale, and that the desert itself was a fence. Where would people go? The nearest town was nearest large town was 35 miles away. So people could wander off, and in one case, there's at least one reported incident of an elderly man who wandered off and died in the desert. But people did go off and go to various communities here at Gila River. They would buy things from the community here. Tamales in particular, there's a lot of stories where people are like, oh, I'd go out and buy tamales, and they're delicious, and they're so much better than the food we get in the mess halls. Chickens as well, we'll talk about getting chickens. There are a few oral histories from community members here who talk about remembering going to the camp. One woman who I worked with from the Cultural Resource Management Program, she said her sister remembers sneaking into camp and playing with the Japanese kids during the war. And that was a really happy time. She was like, I remember, she would say going to the camp and playing with all the kids there. And so there were these sort of small areas, these small unofficial areas that people would sneak around the confines of the camp structure, the boundary lines, and seek contact. People would say that they knew that they were on Indian land. There was like newspaper articles where they talked a little bit about it, but there wasn't a lot of encouragement. The government, specifically the WRA, discouraged interaction between Japanese Americans and the communities here, and wanted to move people through the camp as quickly as possible. So they wanted to avoid the camps becoming permanent settlements, and would encourage people to resettle. So after 1943, you could leave camp, but you couldn't go back to the West Coast. So you can go to the Midwest, you can go to the East Coast, if you can get a job. My grandfather ended up going to Cleveland to work at a steel factory. And then they worked in the Midwest and the East Coast until they can get enough money after the war in 1946 to move back to California. But the WRA wanted people to leave the camps and move out east with the idea that they would break up all of the Japan towns and all the concentrations of Japanese Americans, that these camps were just sort of one place that they'd temporarily be. So they really discouraged people from connecting to the local community, from making any meaningful connections, and trying to get them out as soon as possible. But there are these ways that people did sort of circumvent that. There were some sports tournaments where they played baseball and basketball with local students from Gila River, and other areas like that, again, where people could connect on those sort of small personal bases. So those stories, I think, I always find really meaningful and beautiful, but there are so few of them because I think of these policies that were meant to sort of push people out, to keep them away, and keep communities from sort of connecting outside of the official mechanisms of the government. But yeah, thank you for that question. Any other questions? I see a young hand out there on the steps.
I was wondering, why were they locked up in the prison camps?
Why were they locked up in the prison camps? That's a great question. So, with the outbreak of the war, there was a lot of suspicion against Japanese Americans. And the 1980s Congressional Committee stated that there were 3 reasons that led to the incarceration: wartime hysteria, racism, and a crisis of political leadership. So there was all this panic after Pearl Harbor, after the attack in Hawaii, and there was already huge amounts of anti-Japanese sentiment along the West Coast. There was a lot of racism against Japanese people in California, Oregon, and Washington. And with the outbreak of the war, there was this immediate suspicion: how can we trust anybody who's Japanese? General DeWitt, who was put in charge of the Western Defense Command, basically said that any Japanese person is potentially a disloyal spy, and you can't trust anybody. He also wanted to throw all Italians and Germans into concentration camps, but that proved to be basically impractical. There were too many Italians and Germans throughout the West Coast and the East Coast, and so they decided that wasn't possible. And similarly in Hawaii, where sort of ironically the Pearl Harbor attack happened, most Japanese Americans were not incarcerated. Most Japanese Americans in Hawaii were not put into camps because there was such a large portion of the population. Hawaii would ground to a halt. 90% of truck drivers and produce farmers in Hawaii in 1942 were Japanese American. They couldn't operate the economy of the islands without that population, and they didn't have the military personnel to guard all those people in camps. And so in Hawaii, there was never a mass incarceration. Only a small number, a few thousand of people were thrown into camps, mostly community leaders. But on the West Coast, they were taken away because of all these pressure groups, all these different organizations that had anti-Japanese sentiment, and because there wasn't, I think, the political clout of the Japanese American community that had the ability to really push back, and there was nobody in Washington that stood up. There were small communities and community organizations that stood next to Japanese Americans. Notably, Quaker groups were very, spoke out against incarceration and with letter right, but mostly there was very few sort of allies that would speak out against that injustice. So those are the sort of three big reasons. Yes?
So we know that the Japanese American people came here to be incarcerated, and so at the end of their time when they were given $20 in the bus ticket, what percentage of that population opted to stay here in Arizona? And if they did, where did they settle? And then expanding on the government not allowing peoples to interact, is there any oral histories or incidents of intermarriage, or did any people stay in this community?
So most people ended up going back to California. Actually, people wanted to stay at Gila River. In 1945, there was still about 8,000 or 9,000 people in the incarceration camp. About 3,000 or 4,000 people had moved out east. And the people who were here were like, I don't have anything to go back to California. Like, I spent 3 years here building a new life. I don't have a house or an apartment. I don't know. There were reports, and some of the first families that went back to California were being shot at. Some people's houses were burnt down. People were afraid of going back to California and facing this violence. But the War Relocation Authority basically evicted everybody. They're like, we're tearing everything down. You have to leave. They sold a lot of the buildings to local municipalities and to people here in the community. And so there are still some barracks that are present here that people lived in. One of my friends who I worked with here told me his uncle grew up in one of the barracks from the camp. But most people ended up going back to California. A few, I think, went to Phoenix area. There's at least one case, a woman that I sort of encountered by happenstance came to Butte Camp while I was doing research, and we were chatting, and she said, my dad was Japanese and he was here. I'm a community member, and I take my kids here to look at the camp so they sort of know the history. But that's actually the only case I've heard of. We didn't have time to really talk about her family's history, but I think very few intermarried or stayed here in the community. Only a few went to sort of the Phoenix area. Other places like Colorado, which had both a pre-existing Japanese American community, didn't have the, wasn't in the exclusion zone, so those people weren't sent to camp. And then the governor actually said Japanese Americans can come. More people settled in Colorado. There are sort of larger instances of people resettling in Colorado. And then some places in the Midwest, like Chicago, there were sizable populations that stayed out east. But something like 95% of all Japanese Americans returned to the West Coast within the next 10 years, by the mid-50s. Not everybody could go back immediately because of the expense, but as people worked and saved money and were able to send for family members and start renting houses and getting back, most people did return to the West Coast. Not necessarily to the exact places that they came from, but generally to the West Coast.
Maybe I just want to share, or I'd like to share a couple of things that Mr. Stowe was asking about interaction. I remember my father telling me that they would play baseball against each other. Like he didn't say, you know, how if they did it freely or if they had to sleep around. But he remembered being interacting with the game of baseball. And also today the worker is still compensated by the, and they would call it a war relocation account, I believe, and each district gets a set amount of funding still coming from that payment. And I believe it's divided up according to the population of the district. But that's still happening today, and each district decides on how they want to spend it. So for our district, it's for emergencies only. If someone has a family emergency or need of help, they can apply for it. And if the community wishes to honor that, then they'll be able to receive that. And also, I remember probably being 3, 4 years old as a small child. I grew up in one of those barracks. And I always wondered why it was called a barrack, because they would say, go to the barrack, or we're gonna go, we didn't really call it home, I don't remember. But I remember it being referred to, we called it home, but I remember it being referred to as a barrack. And later on, I asked my mother, I'm like, why did they call them barracks? And she said that's what the Army called it. And I didn't know until later, about the camps and all that and where they came from. And I was just wondering how they were able to, like you said, they were either sold or whatever to the community. So I always wondered how they were able to live in one. But I remember seeing the area where I grew up, I remember several families living in that.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, the barracks, initially the War Relocation Authority was going to try to sell most of the barracks to the community here. But then there were protests because there were housing shortages for returning veterans to places like Phoenix and Tucson, where there was this big housing shortage. So they ended up selling the majority of buildings and barracks to returning veterans, and only a portion to the community here. But they did do still a sizable amount. I mean, there were like 8,000 buildings that they eventually sold. But yeah, that's thank you for sharing that. Baseball was by far the most popular sport at Gila River. If you can believe it, there were 32 teams here. You're sort of baseball crazy. And a professional baseball player named Kenichi Zetamura was here at Gila. He was from the Central Valley and ended up designing a baseball field, basically a professional level baseball field that was near Butte Camp towards the southeast corner. That had stands. They used those castor beams to be like the fence poles at the end of the camp. But it was extremely popular. There were a bunch of different baseball fields about. So it doesn't surprise me that was the sport that your father talked about. But yeah, that's incredible. Thank you. I see another 2 hands.
Oh, yeah, do them.
Were they pretty much self-sustaining when they would sit here? Did they have to fend for themselves, or did the government subsidize food for them? I mean, couldn't really farm.
Yeah, so initially food was supplied through the sort of quartermaster's corps from basically the Army's food supply, and people said it was terrible. My aunt remembers like both the quality of the food, just the food generally, but also my aunt would tell me that she remembered like bugs and maggots in some of the food, that there are some foods that she can't eat to this day. She's 88 years old, and she's like, I still can't eat these kinds of food because that's what they served us in those first days at camp. And then when the farming operation got up and running, people would say the food got a lot better. They could grow fresh vegetables. They did grow culturally important vegetables, different kinds of like daikon, napa cabbage, things that were really common in Japanese cooking, gobo or burdock root. And so people had a lot more sort of agency over their own food supply once they got the farming operation up. There was a huge chicken operation. They had a hog farm, they had a cattle farm. A lot of that food actually they ended up selling on the market to help generate, again, this sort of cost-saving plan by the federal government to make the camp sort of economically self-sufficient. So when you look at, sort of surprisingly, the camp menu distributions for the mess halls, the official things that people were given, there's almost no chicken on it. But they had a chicken farm with tens of thousands of chickens. But that was going sort of like into the marketplace and not into the camp. So there were ways in which they were growing food and vegetables that they weren't able to get complete access to. But people did grow their own food as well. People kept animals and chickens. There's also, we found rabbit bones in those trash deposits. People were trapping rabbits and cooking them. So people were getting food from all sorts of different places as well to supplement what the mess hall and supplies were from camp. Did you have another question up there?
Well, oh, did you raise your hand?
Yeah. Word of you raising your hand, let me see. I was wondering, what would happen if you had a dog or a cat and you got captured by the concentration camp?
Yeah, so pets, that's in most cases a really sad part of the story. Well, all that's really sad, but a lot of families who had pets and animals had to leave their animals at home. They couldn't initially bring them. And then there are some very tragic stories about having to sort of put down the family dog before going to camp because they couldn't take them with them. They couldn't find somebody to take care of the animal when they left. Eventually, pets were allowed. There were dogs that were brought in. There are some cases where people had friends who were not Japanese in California who drove out their dogs to bring them to camp. But the majority of pets initially were not allowed for the first year until restrictions loosened and then people could bring pets in. And there are stories and some photographs of dogs and cats at camp. But yeah, initially pets were not allowed, and so a lot of people lost their cats and dogs. Or there are a few really wonderful stories of people saying that they had cats that they let go, then they came to camp, and then they came back 3 years later, and eventually the cat returned as well. But there was a lot of heartache and heartbreak around pets. Yes?
I don't know how connected you are. I'm sorry I was late coming in with the Heritage Center here, but one of the things that I was really interested in is I was attending the Japanese Awareness Day a couple of 2-3 weeks ago in London. And one of the films that was being shown was Our Lost Years. And I don't know if you're familiar with Lane Ishikawa. And that was one of the films that was shown, and how connected you are here but I really feel very strongly about that film being shown here at some point, maybe to follow up your discussion. Because a lot of what you're talking about is interesting, but in the discussion sitting with, I was the only non-Japanese person there, but when they were having their discussion, it was very intense, very harsh. They were talking, even, and in that film, they show when they go to ask for the money, the fight to ask for the money, put that dollar amount along with the apology, their comments were, they have to because that's what the US government recognizes as dollars, not the true apology. So they went and moved forward for that, but there's a scene in that film where, like this, in the audience, when the gentleman is testifying in Congress, that an Anglo woman comes down the stairs and starts fighting, and there's a fight in there. I mean, it's pretty intense, and I appreciate what you're saying, but the intensity of what occurred from the people themselves is a lot more harsh than what you're describing. Also, one of the things that people probably your age talked a lot about, that was a comment, it wasn't discussed. It wasn't discussed. And many of the people said that the camp, they weren't polite, that these people were off in summer camp having a good time. So there was not even any real acknowledgement, understanding of where their family came from. And one thing I wanted to share, which I think is really weird, we had dinner about a month or two ago with a young man. You know, I always talk about this internment camp because I feel like it's truly an internment camp inside an internment camp. That's how I identify it. But I brought it up at dinner with some people, and one of the gentleman's comments that he was native, never heard of the internment camp, and he said the only way he heard of it was on Karate Kid. And, you know, we were kind of laughing because, you know, Pat Morita was here, in his house here. And Pat, you know, that was his thing, of wanting to get that in the movie. And that's how that was brought out. People didn't have any idea what really that was. And then when it was over, it was like, oh, sorry, you know. And I don't know if you return out to the land. I do to look at the desecration that's happened to the monument. You know, and I know that Lane was very instrumental in getting a lot of people to clean it up. So anyway, some comments, but I would like to see that movie here to follow what you're doing. And like I said, I don't know what your relationship with this heritage center is.
Thank you. You know, I think those are great suggestions. I think the testimonies from those congressional hearings in the 80s are extremely powerful. I've watched, there's dozens of hours of them. I've watched several. They're heartbreaking, they're emotional. I think if I'm guessing correctly, the scene, one of the scenes you're describing, Lillian Baker, was a white woman who was very opposed to any sort of reparation or apology, and would often come barging into the testimonies and scream that the camps were all lies, that this isn't true, that it never happened, and wrote several books trying to discredit it. And as recently as 2006, Michelle Malkin wrote a book, this like news commentator, justifying the incarceration camps. And in the last 5 years, there have been both various lawmakers as well as news pundits who have talked about how the camps were justified, and there's always this sort of, or that they weren't that bad. And so I apologize if I didn't sort of talk about some more of the harsh realities of camp enough. I never want to sort of portray the camp totally as this like pleasant experience, because I think you're right. There is a lot of pain and suffering, and a lot of real toll that stayed with the Japanese American community and stays with the Japanese American community to this day. And it's really important that, I think, as well as these sort of points of beauty like the gardens are highlighted, that there's also this acknowledgement of the extreme violence, the pain, the suffering, the exposure of all sorts of different points of loss of dignity, different points of attack. that people suffered while in camp, and that's really an essential part of the story. And so, yeah, I think that showing films like Lane's are important. Thank you for that. And Pat Morita, as you said, was incarcerated here at Gila River. He was actually one of many who were in tuberculosis wards in California. And as a child with tuberculosis, was then sent to Gila River from the tuberculosis ward, and then stayed here in Gila River before eventually going back to California, and did advocate really strongly for that scene to be included in the Karate Kid that talked about the incarceration camps, which was really important to him. And I think was one of the first sort of big cinematic moments. There's been a few that I mentioned, Bad Day at Black Rock with Spencer Tracy was another one. But there weren't that, there's this sort of historical amnesia that happened with both the silences and the ways in which the government never acknowledged the camps in the initial years afterwards. That's really made it difficult for people to acknowledge it, to remember it. I went to a cleanup of the Gila River Monument once in 2015 at Butte, and afterwards we went to a restaurant here, and there was all these Japanese Americans, and the waitress at the restaurant was asking us what we were doing in town, and we sort of explained it to her. And she was working here at the casino, the restaurant, the casino, and she said, I had never heard of this. I had no idea that any Japanese Americans were incarcerated in World War II, let alone a few miles away from here. No idea. She was in her early 40s and had never heard of the incarceration experience. It's not in every state's curriculum. Some schools don't teach it, some schools only teach it briefly, and it varies widely by state as well. But yes, thank you so much for those comments. Yes?
I think to your reference to acknowledgement, would you talk a little bit about the change in language from internment camp to incarceration, and there was concentration from one of your photographs?
Yeah, so often they're referred to as internment camps. There's been a movement since the 80s to turn away from internment as a term, because internment is a legal category that refers to the confinement of enemy aliens, non-citizens by a state. So there are internment camps that held non-US citizens, and there are actually a few of those also around the country. Kuski in Idaho is one. There are various Justice Department run internment camps that held smaller groups of non-US citizens, but they don't accurately describe these camps, which is why there was a move towards incarceration. Concentration camp is the literal definition of what these were. These were concentration camps. Often that language isn't used because using concentration camp inevitably draws in the concentration camps in Europe during the same time period, and often invites people to compare them and say, well, if they weren't the gas chambers of Auschwitz, they weren't that bad. And so I usually use incarceration camp or prison camp to describe them, because I don't want to invite people to create a hierarchy of suffering and say like, well, if they weren't the Nazi camps, then they were okay, and invite that kind of comparative logic into the conversation. But I fully support the use of both concentration camp and incarceration camp to describe what these were as places of confinement and imprisonment based on an aspect of identity of a community. And that's what these were. They were never charged with a crime. There were no instances of espionage or sabotage by Japanese Americans documented. And they were concentrated, they were put and confined in these camps because of purely their identity.
Is this usage of words becoming more common? I mean, could you pick up an article in the newspaper that actually said incarceration?
It is becoming more common. Incarceration camp became part of the official style guide of the New York Times. and the AP in the last 3 years. And it's become more and more frequently used in newspaper articles. There's still a lot that will say internment camp, but it's growing mostly because of the advocacy from within the Japanese American community to use that terminology.
So with regard to your comments about crimes and crimes committed, some of the, there were a few small camps, and you have one on your map, like the one in Luke, Arizona, where they sent the people who were, who broke the law. So what sort of infraction put you in that category as one who needed to go to that, and it was a person or jail or whatever?
Yeah, so Loop is in particular, and I want to shout out to Davina Two Bears in the audience there, my colleague and a fellow at ASU. We're going out to do a project at Loop this summer. Loop was a former boarding school in the Navajo Nation that was turned into an isolation prison for Japanese Americans. And first they were sent to Moab in Utah, and then to Loop. And Moab was a civilian conservation corps work camp where people were sent to for 3 months and then transferred to Loop after it closed as a boarding school and then reopened as this prison. These were the so-called quote-unquote troublemakers. So within the initial months of camp, there were political agitators, there were people who advocated for strikes, people who did, in some cases, advocate for violence, but mostly people who resisted in various means the War Relocation Authority and challenged it, who protested, who engaged in community organization against the administration, and all these kinds of activities ended up getting these community leaders imprisoned because they were considered sort of rabble-rousers and that they were disturbing the peace. So a few dozen of them, about 55 initially, were sent to Moab and then transferred to Loop. There's a couple dozen more after that. And then in 1943, the WRA sent out a loyalty questionnaire. That's what it was called. This questionnaire that people had to fill out, and questions 27 and 28 were the most controversial. They asked if you would forswear all loyalty to the Emperor of Japan, and if you would fight if called upon for the United States in the military. And for many people, this created a lot of fear and anxiety, especially amongst older Japanese who were like, I'm 80, I'm 60, what do you mean go fight in the US military at this age? For Issei, who were legally barred from naturalizing as US citizens, if they answered yes to 27, there was real fear that they would become stateless persons, that they would renounce their Japanese citizenship, be barred from naturalizing as US citizens, and have no citizenship status after that point. And then even fewer legal protections under international law. There are also people who were generally pissed off, who said, I won't answer yes to these questions until you restore my civil rights. I will not fight. I'd be willing to fight in the US Army in a time of war if I was treated as a US citizen. And so there were groups of people who protested for various reasons. They were called no-nos, and a special segregation prison was erected at Tule Lake in Northern California, where these people were sent to. Several of them were repatriated to Japan. Many of them lost US citizenship, and then the lawyer Wayne Collins, after the war, helped reverse those citizenship renunciations due to the really unfair situation that people were put in to have to even answer those questions in the first place, and the kinds of duress that they were under in that situation. So there were different reasons people were considered troublemakers. In the initial internment camps like Kuski, these smaller camps, primarily non-US citizens, community leaders, priests, ministers, leaders of professional organizations were sent to these smaller prison camps even before the 10 camps were constructed. And the idea of the US government were these were the most likely people to be subversive agents. And also these were the leaders of the community. And if we took away the leaders of the community would be easier to sort of incarcerate and remove, because a lot of the folks that you would go to and talk to, like the president of your local organization or your union or your what have you, has been just put into prison. So what do you do after that? Right? It's a lot harder to organize. So there was this initial raid of several thousand people by the FBI that were sent immediately after Pearl Harbor, within a week, to these smaller internment camps. And then some more people who were separated off as these other kinds of protests took place, or this loyalty questionnaire, the so-called loyalty questionnaire, was administered that people answered no to. There's another hand.
Yeah, real quickly, thank you for sharing your family story, and I can see how it directly relates to the research that you've done in this particular area. I'm just wondering, how are you gonna, or how is your research gonna be integrated into the larger narrative? As we look at some of the indigenous archaeologists that are out there and how they're taking ownership in the history and actually getting involved in incorporating oral traditions and oral histories into the telling narrative. What is that looking like for the larger narrative and history reporting? Is that something that your research is going to fold into, or is it already moving that way?
Yeah, so when I think about sort of how incorporating my research into these larger narratives, one of the things I'm working on right now is writing a book about Gila River and the research I've been doing there. But also, part of the reason I initially started this project in 2013, a long time ago, was because there was a real frustration with a lack of Japanese Americans involved in directing archaeology projects. And in fact, at that time, there were no Japanese Americans who were directing archaeology projects at any of the incarceration camps. It was predominantly white archaeologists from the National Park Service or from universities, many of whom are good colleagues and have done good work. But I was sort of both annoyed and worried that there was nobody from within the Japanese American community that's involved with telling the narrative from an archaeological perspective. There are many Japanese Americans who are doing great work in film, in literature, in other historical venues, but not in archaeology. And so starting this project was a way to both think about doing an archaeology that was personally relevant, that also in that way would hold me accountable, because it's my community. If I say something wrong, someone's gonna call my auntie and be like, what's your nephew saying? You can't outrun that. The auntie network is too strong. But also that I felt like it was very important for members of our community to be involved in creating these narratives, that they shouldn't be told from without only. And so that's been something that I've been involved with other organizations, working on Day of Remembrance programming, online programming, film production, book writing, to make sure that we're involved with the creation and maintenance of these narratives, museum exhibits, and they're not only happening from somebody else. So I've been trying to work with that. I'm trying to also help other Japanese Americans who are involved in these projects and support them as well, because I think that's really important. And that's something that both a lot of people coming from indigenous archaeology and Black archaeology in America have really shown a path forward to, and really made these inroads with their community stories that I've taken a lot of mentorship and inspiration from in doing. So thank you for that question. 2 more questions, so one in the back and then one up here.
I'm not sure if I missed it at the beginning, but was the West Coast just really racist and the East and Middle Midwest were not? Or is it because there was more Japanese American living on the West Coast? Like, how come the other part of the country was not doing that?
So it was mainly because the vast majority of Japanese Americans were on the West Coast. There are much smaller communities in the East, and in the Midwest. When my grandparents went to Virginia in 1946, my grandmother told me that the people there thought they were Italian. Slicked back black hair, sort of dark skin. Are you Italian? But there were just much fewer Japanese, and so it was considered both militarily a bigger threat along the West Coast, but also there weren't the same kind of pressure groups that formed in the first half of the 20th century that often came out of farm labor movements and industrial work movements. So like Japanese Americans were barred from union membership for most of the early half of the 20th century. And there was a lot of farm competition and worried because that was the largest profession that Japanese Americans were in, something like 24%. Working adults worked in farms, and another 18% were in farm labor. So there was a lot of Japanese people involved in agriculture, and then a lot of non-Japanese pressure groups, mostly white pressure groups, that were in agriculture that pushed out against them, and that were also supported these sort of anti-Japanese legislation. That was also linked to these sort of larger anti-Chinese movements that were coming out of the 18th or 19th century. Yes.
One question or a comment. There was an internment camp in Bush, Arizona, about 300 miles west of here, on the Colorado River Indian Community. And that tribe has a museum, travel museum, that was recently renovated about 2 years ago. And they dedicated a portion of their museum to the Japanese people and the internment camp for educational purposes.
Thank you. Yeah, I haven't had a chance to visit, but I have some friends and colleagues who have gone out there. And there's a lot of work that the Japanese American community, the descendant community who posted this, were doing with the tribe about commemorating the camp experience, both in the museum and in annual pilgrimages out to it. Thank you. Yeah. If there are no more questions, thank you so much for coming out tonight.